When the First World War ended in 1918, the map of Europe was redrawn. Among the new states to emerge from the wreckage of empires was Poland, a nation reborn after 123 years of partitions by Russia, Prussia, and Austria-Hungary. For over a century, Poland had existed only in the hearts, minds, and clandestine schools of its people. Now, for the first time since the late 18th century, the Polish flag flew over Warsaw. But the birth of the Second Polish Republic was anything but secure. Its resurrection was shaped by war, uncertainty, and the conflicting ambitions of neighboring powers. Borders in flux, Poland's frontiers were far from settled in 1918. The collapse of imperial rule left a patchwork of armies, militias, and revolutionary councils competing for control. The new state was immediately engaged in armed conflicts on multiple fronts. West, skirmishes with German forces unwilling to cede territory. South, disputes with Czechoslovakia over Silesia and Silesia. East, a war with Soviet Russia. 1919 to 1921, culminating in the famous Battle of Warsaw, where Polish forces stopped the Red Army's westward push. North, disputes with Lithuania over Vilnius, and questions over access to the Baltic Sea. Each border was contested not only by foreign armies, but also by local populations with mixed ethnic identities. Adding another layer of volatility, an ethnically diverse state, the Poland that emerged after the Versailles settlement was a multi-ethnic state, home to Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Jews, Germans, Lithuanians, and others. In some eastern regions, ethnic Poles were a minority. While the Constitution promised equal rights to all citizens, tensions between groups were frequent, fueled by cultural differences, competing nationalisms, and economic hardship. Political instability. Poland's political life in the interwar years was turbulent. The young republic was a parliamentary democracy in theory, but factionalism and short-lived governments became the norm. Between 1918 and 1926, more than a dozen governments came and went, unable to maintain stability in a country still recovering from war. This instability paved the way for Piłsudski's coup of 1926, after which he ruled as the dominant political figure until his death in 1935. Piłsudski's regime curtailed some democratic freedoms, but maintained a degree of political pluralism, at least compared to the authoritarian states surrounding Poland. Between two hostile powers, geography placed Poland in a precarious position. To the west was Germany, resentful over the loss of territory under the Treaty of Versailles, especially the Polish corridor that cut off East Prussia from the rest of the Reich. To the east was the Soviet Union, still nursing ambitions of spreading communism westward and viewing Poland as a temporary obstacle. Both powers considered Poland's existence an inconvenience if not an outright affront to their strategic goals. The survival of the republic depended on balancing between these two giants, while securing alliances with Western powers like France and Britain. A fragile achievement by the late 1930s, Poland had built a functioning state, developed its economy, and modernized parts of its military. Yet its position remained fragile, politically isolated, economically strained, and militarily weaker than its neighbors. The Second Polish Republic had been born in defiance of history, geography, and the ambitions of great powers. But as Europe drifted toward another war, Poland's very survival would once again be tested. In 1939, overwhelmed. For a brief moment in the early 1930s, it seemed that Poland had carved out a precarious place for itself between two dangerous neighbors. In 1932, Warsaw signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, followed by a similar agreement with Nazi Germany in 1934. On paper, these pacts promised stability. In reality, they were no more than thin ice over deep, dark water. Beneath the diplomatic handshakes, both Berlin and Moscow viewed the Polish state as a mistake of history, an accident born from the collapse of empires and the whims of the Treaty of Versailles. To Adolf Hitler, Poland was an obstacle on the road to Lebensraum, living space for the German people, to be seized from the east. His gaze lingered on the lands taken from Germany after the Great War, the Polish corridor, West Prussia, and Silesia. These territories were not just soil, they were symbols of humiliation. To recover them was, in Hitler's eyes, a step toward restoring Germany's rightful place in Europe. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin's intentions were harder to read, but no less ominous. Some historians argue he sought to reabsorb the lands lost by the Tsar after 1917, knitting the old Russian Empire back together under the Red Banner. Others suggest he wanted to push the Soviet frontier westward, creating a buffer zone of conquered lands between his regime and any potential enemy. Still others claim that Stalin was simply opportunistic, ready to pounce on any territory that circumstances might offer. Whatever the motive, the Soviet leadership shared one certainty: the Polish state was illegitimate and temporary. The hostility was not just political, it was personal and brutal. The Soviet regime's mistrust of Poles ran deep. During the Great Terror of 1937–1938, ethnic Poles in the USSR were specifically targeted in what is now called the Polish operation of the NKVD. Tens of thousands were arrested, deported, or executed on fabricated charges of espionage or counter-revolutionary activity. Even Polish communists, ostensibly loyal to Moscow, were not spared. To Stalin, Polishness itself could be a crime. Poland, aware of the dangers but unable to match either neighbor's military might, sought to keep both sides at bay through careful diplomacy. Yet its semi-authoritarian government, led in this period by Prime Minister Sławuj Składkowski, was far from naive. The pacts were not trust, but breathing space. Warsaw's military planners quietly ranked the USSR as the more likely threat, a judgment shaped by memories of the Polish-Soviet War and the ideological gulf between them. German rhetoric in the early 1930s, while resentful, still seemed less immediately threatening than Bolshevik expansionism. But the winds of Europe were shifting. Hitler was rearming Germany at a pace that stunned foreign observers, and his speeches grew ever bolder about overturning the Versailles Order. Stalin, meanwhile, was building an army whose sheer size could overwhelm most European states. The stage was set for Poland to be squeezed caught in a vice whose jaws were slowly, inevitably closing. At diplomatic receptions in Warsaw, foreign envoys would toast peace in our time. But privately, Polish officials could sense the pacts with Berlin and Moscow were little more than lullabies before the storm. The year 1938 marked a turning point in European diplomacy and a dangerous one for Poland. Hitler's rise in Germany was no longer just a domestic phenomenon, it was reshaping the map of Europe. His first bold move came with the Anschluss in March, when Austria was annexed without a single shot fired. The swiftness of this takeover alarmed Warsaw, but the real shock came later that year, in the Sudeten crisis. At Munich in September 1938, Britain and France, desperate to avoid another continental war, agreed to let Hitler seize the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. Poland, officially neutral in the dispute, nonetheless, took advantage of the chaos to reclaim the disputed Zaolzie region from the Czechs' territory lost after World War I and resented ever since. This short-term gain would prove diplomatically costly. Many in London and Paris began to see Poland not as a victim in waiting, but as an opportunist, little better than Germany itself. Meanwhile, Hitler's appetite only grew. The destruction of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, when German troops marched into Prague, revealed his true ambitions. He would not stop at uniting German lands. His gaze shifted toward Poland specifically, the free city of Danzig, modern Gdańsk, a semi-autonomous port under League of Nations protection, but dominated by ethnic Germans. To Hitler, Danzig was both a symbol and a strategic prize. Control of it would connect East Prussia to the rest of the Reich and undermine Poland's access to the sea. In late 1938 and early 1939, Berlin's tone hardened. Through diplomatic channels, Germany demanded not only the return of Danzig, but also the construction of an extraterritorial highway and railway across the Polish corridor. In return, Hitler offered vague promises of respecting Poland's borders and extending the non-aggression pact. But in Warsaw, these proposals were read for what they were: the opening moves in a campaign to turn Poland into a German satellite. Foreign Minister Beck, a reserved and calculating figure, rejected the demands outright in public speeches. His most famous, delivered on May 5, 1939, was a defiant assertion that there is only one thing in the life of people, nations, and states that is without price. That thing is honor. These words electrified Polish patriots, but in the back rooms of Berlin, they closed the door to peaceful compromise. At the same time, Britain and France, belatedly realizing that appeasement had failed, began to court Poland as a potential ally against German aggression. In March 1939, London offered a guarantee of Polish independence, soon joined by Paris. This was a diplomatic gamble. Neither Britain nor France had the means to save Poland quickly if war broke out, but the gesture was meant to deter Hitler. Instead, it had the opposite effect. Hitler saw the Western guarantee as a challenge to his will, and began preparing for a military solution. The storm was gathering. In Danzig, Nazi banners fluttered over government buildings, while local party militias grew bolder in harassing Polish officials and residents. In Berlin, Hitler's rhetoric grew sharper, painting Poland as an aggressor blocking Germany's rightful unity. And in Warsaw, Beck's diplomats scrambled to balance between Western promises and the ever-present Soviet threat in the East. By the summer of 1939, Europe stood on the edge. The pacts that once promised peace were now just scraps of paper, and the question was no longer if there would be war, but when. Spring and summer of 1939 were a feverish race in the chancelleries of Europa, desperate attempt to avert war, or at least to decide who would be left standing when it came. The crisis over Danzig had already hardened into open hostility between Berlin and Warsaw, but the real question was whether anyone could build an alliance strong enough to deter Hitler. For Britain and France, the answer seemed obvious. Poland could not stand alone. If a German attack came, it would almost certainly be followed by Soviet moves from the east. Thus, in April 1939, London and Paris began exploring a grand alliance of Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and Poland, a coalition that, on paper, might check German ambitions. But there was a problem as old as Poland's borders: history and distrust. The memories of 1920, when the Red Army had marched toward Warsaw during the Polish-Soviet War, were still raw. For Polish leaders, Stalin's armies were not saviors but conquerors in waiting. Even if Moscow promised to help repel Hitler, what guarantee was there that they would leave afterward? Foreign Minister Beck understood this risk all too well. With the Germans, he privately told colleagues, "We lose our freedom. With the Russians, we lose our soul." Negotiations dragged on through the summer. British and French delegations traveled to Moscow in August, but they arrived without urgency, taking a slow boat instead of a fast plane, a gesture Stalin read as proof of their lack of seriousness. The talks bogged down over a single critical point: the Soviets demanded the right to move their troops through Polish territory in case of a German attack. Beck refused outright, fearing that once the Red Army entered Poland, it would never leave. While the West wrangled over protocol, Hitler acted. Through secret channels, he opened talks with Stalin himself. The two dictators, though ideological enemies, shared a common interest in avoiding a two-front war. In just days, their envoys Joachim von Ribbentrop for Germany and Vyacheslav Molotov for the Soviet Union drafted the most cynical diplomatic accord of the century. On August 23, 1939, the world learned of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Publicly, it was sold as a peace agreement. Privately, a secret protocol divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland was to be carved in two, along the Narew, Vistula, and San rivers. Germany taking the west, the USSR, the east. The Baltic states were also parceled out like spoils on a map. The signing of the pact was a thunderclap in European capitals. In Warsaw, it was nothing short of a death sentence. The nightmare scenario, an alliance of Poland's to mortal enemies, had come true. The Western guarantees now seemed almost hollow, for Britain and France could not reach Poland before both German and Soviet armies did. Still, Poland refused to bow. Beck and the government in Warsaw reaffirmed their rejection of Hitler's demands. Mobilization plans were accelerated, fortifications along the western border reinforced, and the Polish army prepared as best it could for the blow they all knew was coming. The last diplomatic gambit had failed. The chessboard was set, the pieces in place. All that remained was for someone to make the first move, and everyone knew it would come soon. By late August 1939, Hitler had already chosen war. What remained was the pretext of story to justify the invasion of Poland to the German people and to the world. The Führer understood the value of appearing as the victim, not the aggressor, and he was willing to manufacture the evidence. On August 31, 1939, the SS launched Unternehmen Himmler, Operation Himmler, a series of coordinated false flag attacks designed to create the illusion of Polish aggression along the German border. Dozens of staged incidents were planned: railway sabotage, shootings, and assaults on German customs posts, all blamed on supposed Polish saboteurs. The most infamous of these took place at a small radio station in the Silesian town of Gliwice. The operation there was overseen by SS Sturmbannführer Alfred Nowak. That evening, a small SS team, dressed in civilian clothes, stormed the Gliwice transmitter. They fired shots, broadcast a brief anti-German statement in Polish, and left behind several corpses in Polish uniforms as proof of the attack. The dead men were not Polish soldiers at all, but prisoners from concentration camps, murdered by lethal injection earlier that day, then shot to make the scene convincing. The SS referred to these victims chillingly as conserved canned goods. Other staged incidents occurred the same night, including attacks on the Hochlinden customs station and a railway near Pitch. In total, more than 20 false operations were carried out, all pointing to an alleged Polish campaign of cross-border terrorism. The propaganda machine went into overdrive. The next morning, German newspapers carried headlines about Polish bandits striking at the Reich, while radio broadcasts dripped with outrage and calls for retribution. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1, 1939, just hours after the Gliwice incident, German troops crossed the Polish frontier along a 1,000-kilometer front. In a speech to the Reichstag later that morning, Hitler declared, with studied indignation, "Since 5:45 this morning, we have been returning fire, and from now on, bombs will be met with bombs." It was a lie from start to finish, but one that served its purpose. The fabricated attacks gave the appearance of self-defense, dulling any domestic opposition to war. Internationally, the ruse fooled almost no one. British and French intelligence suspected immediately that the provocations were staged, but it made little difference. The fuse had been lit. Gliwice was not just a petty act of deception, it was the final act of peace. Within days, the world would be engulfed in the war Hitler had so carefully engineered. The invasion of Poland Fall Weiss Case White was not conceived as a cautious, probing operation. It was designed from the outset as a lightning war, a rapid and overwhelming strike to crush Poland before her allies could react. Hitler wanted Warsaw captured in weeks, perhaps even days, and the Wehrmacht's planner sunder. The direction of General Franz Halder crafted a plan to deliver just that. The concept was brutally simple. Strike from 3 directions at once, using speed, shock, and encirclement to annihilate Polish resistance. 1. The northern pincer from East Prussia, General Fedor von Bock's Army Group North, would drive southward. The Third Army, under General Georg von Kuchler, would push toward the Vistula River, while the Fourth Army, under General Gunther von Kluge, would advance toward the Polish corridor and link up with forces attacking from Pomerania. This would cut off the corridor and isolate the coastal city of Gdynia while sealing off Polish forces in the north. 2. The southern pincer from Silesia and Slovakia, General Gerd von Rundstedt's Army Group South, would push north. The Eighth Army, under General Johannes Blaskowitz, would strike toward fixing Polish forces in place. Meanwhile, the 10th Army commanded by General Walther von Reichenau was the hammer blow. Spearheaded by fast-moving panzer divisions under generals like Heinz Guderian, the 14th Army, under General Wilhelm List, would move from Slovakia toward and aiming to envelop Poland's southern defenses. 3. The central breakthrough. The German plan relied on deep penetrations, bypassing strongpoints to envelop and destroy whole Polish armies. Luftwaffe support was critical. Hermann Göring's air fleets would bomb airfields, railways, and communications in the first hours, blinding and paralyzing Polish command before the ground assault fully unfolded. Stukas would dive-bomb troop concentrations and sow panic among civilians, clogging roads with refugees and further slowing Polish mobilization. The Germans expected to exploit 2 major weaknesses in Poland's position: geography. Poland's long exposed front meant its army had to defend on multiple axes, leaving it thin everywhere. Mobilization. Poland's forces were still transitioning from peacetime to wartime footing. Full mobilization had been delayed. Under British and French pressure to avoid provoking Hitler by the time the first shots were fired, many Polish units were still assembling. Deception and psychological warfare. Case White was not purely military. The Gleiwitz incident and other false flag operations would frame the invasion as a defensive war. Leaflets, radio broadcasts, and loudspeaker propaganda units would call on Polish soldiers to surrender and accuse their leaders of betrayal. Timetable. Hitler initially set the invasion for August 26, 1939, but postponed it when news came that Britain had signed a formal alliance with Poland. The delay gave Germany time to finalize the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, ensuring Soviet neutrality. Once that was secured, Case White was set to launch at dawn on September 1st. The Wehrmacht expected the campaign to last no more than 3 weeks. This confidence bordered on arrogance, but it was built on a grim calculation. By the time Britain and France could mount any meaningful action in the West, Poland would already be beaten. The machine was ready. All that was left was to unleash it. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1st, 1939, without a formal declaration of war, the German invasion of Poland began. Across a front more than 1,600 kilometers long, the roar of artillery, the screech of Stuka sirens, and the grinding advance of tanks shattered the stillness of the morning. The first blows came from the air. Luftwaffe squadrons struck Polish airfields, communication centers, and railway hubs in coordinated waves. The aim was not merely to destroy Poland's air force, but to paralyze its ability to mobilize and coordinate a defense. By mid-morning, dozens of Polish aircraft had been destroyed, many still on the ground, though a number of fighters managed to scramble and engage the enemy in the skies. One of the earliest and most symbolic acts of the war unfolded in the Baltic. The German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, ostensibly on a courtesy visit to the free city of Danzig, suddenly turned its guns on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte. For 7 days, fewer than 200 Polish defenders, vastly outgunned and outnumbered, would hold off repeated assaults, becoming an instant symbol of national resistance. On the ground, the German plan unfolded with ruthless precision. North, from East Prussia, General Georg von Kuchler's Third Army pushed south toward the Vistula, while General Gunther von Kluge's Fourth Army struck from Pomerania, aiming to cut the Polish corridor and link the 2 northern prongs. Center, General Walther von Reichenau's 10th Army, spearheaded by the 19th Panzer Corps under Heinz Guderian, punched deep into Polish territory toward fast-moving armored columns bypassed strongpoints, aiming to encircle entire Polish formations. South, General Wilhelm List's 14th Army surged north from Slovakia toward and threatening to envelop the Polish southern flank. The Stukas became the terror of the day. Their screaming sirens, deliberately designed to unnerve, caused panic among both soldiers and civilians. Columns of refugees' families with carts, livestock, and whatever possessions they could carry clogged the roads, hampering Polish troop movements and making them vulnerable to strafing runs. Despite the shock, the Polish army fought back fiercely. In several areas, cavalry brigades, still an integral part of Poland's mobile forces, launched counterattacks, often buying time for infantry to withdraw to more defensible positions. The most famous of these, at Krogenty, would later be twisted by German propaganda into the false tale of Polish cavalry charging tanks with sabers. By the evening of September 1st, the scale of the assault was clear. The German front lines had already penetrated deep into Polish territory, and the Luftwaffe's dominance of the skies made every movement perilous. Still, Warsaw's commanders were determined to resist, ordering defensive lines to be formed along the Vistula and Narew rivers. The war that many had feared and others had tried desperately to prevent was now a brutal reality. Europe had crossed the threshold, and in London and Paris, leaders faced the question that would decide the fate of the continent. Would they honor their guarantees to Poland with words or with war? Among the early battles of the German invasion, one episode became legendary, though not for the reasons history books often repeat. It involved Poland's famed cavalry, the WWII, and the enduring myth that they charged German tanks with sabers. The reality was more complex and more tragic. The Polish cavalry in 1939, despite the romantic image of horsemen galloping into battle, the Polish cavalry of 1939 was not a relic of the Napoleonic age. These units were mobile infantry mounted to travel quickly, but trained and equipped to fight dismounted, often supported by anti-tank rifles, light artillery, and machine guns. Their horses were for mobility, not direct combat against armored vehicles. Poland's cavalry brigades were among the best trained, most disciplined formations in the army, often tasked with delaying actions, reconnaissance, and surprise strikes against enemy infantry. But in the chaos of September 1939, they found themselves facing overwhelming odds. The skirmish at Krogenty. September 1, 1939. On the very first day of the war, elements of the 18th Pomeranian Ulan Regiment, commanded by Colonel Kazimierz Mastelers, encountered German infantry resting in a clearing near the village of Krogenty. The Germans had halted, their armored support lagging behind. Recognizing a fleeting opportunity, Mastelers ordered a cavalry charge sabers drawn aimed at scattering the infantry and buying time for Polish forces to regroup. The attack was a success. The surprised German infantry broke under the sudden assault, but the victory was short. As the Poles pursued, German armored cars, part of the advance guard, appeared and opened fire with machine guns and cannons. Mastelers was killed in the engagement, and the regiment suffered heavy casualties. Birth of a myth in the aftermath. Italian and German war correspondents were brought to the battlefield, where dead horses and fallen cavalrymen lay near armored vehicles. German propaganda eagerly seized the scene, fabricating the claim that the foolish Poles had charged tanks with sabers, a symbol of outdated military thinking. The truth that the cavalry had struck infantry and been counterattacked by armored cars was lost in the fog of war and the power of a compelling, if false, image. For decades, the myth persisted, overshadowing the tactical reality and the bravery shown by the Polish soldiers. Other cavalry actions. Krogenty was not unique. Throughout the campaign, Polish cavalry units, such as at Mokra on September 1st, proved capable of inflicting serious damage on German forces, especially in terrain unsuitable for tanks. At Mokra, cavalry brigade used concealed positions and anti-tank weapons to destroy dozens of German armored vehicles, halting their advance for an entire day. Legacy of courage. While the myth of sabers against tanks painted Poles as reckless and doomed, the reality was one of skillful, disciplined troops fighting with the tools they had against an enemy with superior numbers and technology. The cavalrymen of 1939 were not relics. They were professional soldiers who understood modern war, but were trapped in a situation where courage had to compensate for material disadvantage. And so, in the opening week of the war, Poland's horsemen carved both history and legend into the story of the September campaign, one through facts, the other through propaganda. By the second week of September 1939, the thunder of German artillery could be heard in Warsaw. What had begun as a distant frontline battle was now pressing against the gates of the capital itself. Refugees streamed in from the countryside, peasants with carts, soldiers cut off from their units, entire families carrying whatever they could salvage. The city, still functioning under a veneer of normal life, braced for the storm. The German advance on the capital, after rapid gains in the west and north. The Wehrmacht sought to encircle Warsaw before the Polish army could organize a meaningful defense. General Walther von Reichenau's 10th Army drove toward the city from the southwest, while General Heinz Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps pressed from the north. After crossing the Narew, Luftwaffe squadrons bombed rail lines, bridges, and roads, cutting supply and escape routes. On September 8, elements of the German 4th Panzer Division reached the outskirts of Warsaw, astonishing even their own commanders with the speed of the advance. But this bold push also exposed them to fierce resistance. Polish defenders, supported by anti-tank guns and hastily organized barricades, managed to repulse the first assaults. The Germans pulled back temporarily to regroup, but the psychological blow had been dealt. the capital was no longer safe. Inside the city, Warsaw's mayor, Stefan Sterczewski, took to the radio daily, urging calm and encouraging citizens to assist in the defense. His broadcasts, clear and resolute, became a rallying cry: "We shall defend our city to the last brick." Volunteer students, factory workers, civil servants joined soldiers in building barricades, digging trenches, and stringing barbed wire across main streets. Food stocks were rationed. Hospitals prepared for mass casualties. The Polish Air Force, greatly outnumbered, still managed to launch sorties from hidden airstrips, harassing German bombers where possible. The bombing of Warsaw from September 10th onward, the Luftwaffe began systematic bombing of the city. Factories, railway stations, and military depots were prime targets, but residential areas suffered as well. Entire neighborhoods burned. The night sky was lit by the glow of flames. Casualties mounted thousands killed or wounded within days. The sound of sirens became an almost constant background to life. The destruction had a grim dual effect. It stiffened the resolve of many to fight on, but also flooded the streets with desperate civilians seeking shelter, making military movement within the city more difficult. The encirclement closes by mid-September. German forces were tightening the noose. The fall of Modlin Fortress to the north and the advance from the south threatened to isolate Warsaw completely. Still, the city stood defiant. Every delay forced the Germans to divert resources, giving other Polish units fighting at the Buzura River and in the east precious time, symbol, and target. Warsaw had become more than a military objective. It was a political symbol. For Hitler, its capture would demonstrate the inevitability of German victory. For Poland, its survival even for a few more days would prove that the nation had not yet surrendered. As the siege drew near, the battle for Warsaw would soon become one of the most intense urban struggles of the early war, a fight not just for territory, but for the soul of a nation under fire. By early September 1939, most of the Polish army was in retreat. German panzer divisions had sliced deep into the country, threatening Warsaw from multiple directions. Yet in the west, the Polish armies, the Pomors and Poznań, were still largely intact, retreating in good order after avoiding encirclement in the opening days. Their commanders, General Władysław Bartnowski and General Tadeusz Kościuszko, faced a stark choice: continue withdrawing toward the capital, or strike back in a desperate bid to relieve pressure on Warsaw. Kościuszko, a strategist by training, argued for the latter. The result would be the largest Polish counteroffensive of the September campaign, the Battle of the Buzura. The surprise counterattack. September 9th. On the morning of September 9th, Polish forces launched their attack along the Buzura River, northwest of Warsaw. The strike caught the Germans off guard. Expecting a continued Polish retreat, the Wehrmacht had left its flanks exposed. Kościuszko's infantry, supported by cavalry brigades and the last reserves of artilleries, mashed into elements of the German 8th Army. Polish troops recaptured several towns, including Ucieka and Piatek, pushing the enemy back and inflicting heavy casualties. Morale soared. For the first time since the war began, the Poles were advancing. German reaction. The counteroffensive disrupted German plans and forced them to divert forces from their drive on Warsaw. However, the Wehrmacht reacted with characteristic speed and coordination. By September 12, German command had redirected to panzer divisions and Stuka dive bombers to the Buzura front. The open terrain along the river became a killing ground. Luftwaffe formations struck relentlessly, targeting Polish columns on the move, bridges, and supply lines. The lack of Polish air cover meant every movement risked attack from above. Desperate fighting and cavalry charges. Despite mounting losses, Polish cavalry units played a critical role in delaying German encirclement. The Wielkopolska and Podolska cavalry brigades conducted daring charges not against tanks, but to break through German infantry positions or to buy time for withdrawing units. These actions, often at terrible cost, allowed parts of the army to slip toward Warsaw. Kościuszko, recognizing the growing danger, ordered a fighting withdrawal beginning September 15th. But by then, German pincers were closing in from north and south. Encirclement and breakout attempts by September 18th. Most Polish forces at the Buzura were surrounded. In desperate night marches, small groups attempted to break through the Campinos forest toward the capital. Many succeeded, joining the defenders of Warsaw and prolonging its resistance. Others were cut down by German machine gun fire or captured. General Bartnowski was taken prisoner. Kościuszko managed to reach Warsaw, where he would help organize the city's final stand. Outcome and significance. The Battle of the Buzura was the largest engagement of the 1939 campaign, involving over 200,000 Polish troops. Though ultimately a German victory, it delayed the fall of Warsaw by over a week and forced the Wehrmacht to commit significant resources away from the main front. It also became a testament to Polish determination, proof that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the nation could strike back with courage and skill. Yet the cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of Polish soldiers were killed or captured, and the last hope of mounting a large-scale counteroffensive vanished with the battle's end. The road to Warsaw was now open, and the capital's fate would be decided in the coming days. By the third week of September 1939, the Polish capital was a city under siege in every sense. The defeat at the Bzura had sealed Warsaw's fate. The last mobile Polish armies were either destroyed, captured, or retreating into the city. German forces, now free to concentrate on the capital, moved to encircle it completely. The news tightened. By September 16, the Wehrmacht had closed off almost all roads into Warsaw. The fall of Modlin Fortress to the north and the advance of the German 10th Army from the south cut the last escape routes. Only a narrow corridor through the Campinos forest remained, and even this was under constant Luftwaffe attack. General Johannes Blaskowitz's 8th Army and 10th Army positioned their artillery for a siege. Heavy guns, some 210 mm howitzers, were brought up to pound the city from multiple directions. The air war over the city, the Luftwaffe's campaign, intensified dramatically. On September 17, squadrons of Heinkel, He-111, and Dornier Do-17 bombers, escorted by Messerschmitt, Bf-109 fighters, began an unrelenting series of raids. Rail stations, bridges, and military depots were targeted, but so were residential neighborhoods. The Germans aimed not only to destroy Warsaw's defenses, but also to break civilian morale. Fires burned day and night. The glow of flames could be seen for miles. Entire districts, Radmisi, Wola, and Prague, were reduced to rubble. The city's waterworks were hit, cutting clean water supplies and forcing residents to rely on wells and cisterns. Life under siege inside the city. Mayor Stefan Strzynski remained a voice of calm determination. His daily radio broadcasts urged citizens to endure, to keep working on barricades, and to help the wounded. Food stocks dwindled rapidly, with rations cut to the bare minimum. Hospitals overflowed with casualties, soldiers and civilians alike. Makeshift field kitchens appeared in courtyards. Public buildings were converted into shelters. The constant bombardment forced people to live in basements, emerging only to gather water, scavenge for food, or clear rubble. Defiance in the face of destruction. Despite the devastation, Warsaw's Defenders Army units, police, firefighters, and volunteers continued to repel German probing attacks. Snipers harassed enemy infantry. Artillery crews fired until their last shells. On several occasions, Polish counterattacks recaptured lost positions on the city's outskirts. German commanders, frustrated by the stubborn resistance, increased the intensity of their bombardment. The siege was becoming less a battle and more an act of deliberate destruction. The psychological war leaflets dropped by German planes urged surrender, warning that continued resistance would bring total annihilation. Strzynski and the city's defenders rejected these demands. Warsaw's endurance was now a matter of national pride and symbolism. If the capital fell quickly, German propaganda would trumpet it as proof of Poland's weakness. By September 22, Warsaw was almost entirely cut off, bombarded day and night. The people knew the end was coming, but they were determined to make that end cost the enemy dearly. The siege was entering its most terrible phase, and the city's ordeal would soon reach its breaking point. At dawn, on September 17, 1939, while Warsaw still held out against the German siege, a second hammer blow fell upon Poland, this time from the east. Without a formal declaration of war, the Red Army crossed the Polish border along its entire eastern frontier. In accordance with the secret clauses of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed a month earlier between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. A calculated move, the Soviet government announced that the Polish state had ceased to exist, and that it was moving in to protect the Ukrainian and Belarusian populations in eastern Poland. This was a thinly veiled justification for an outright invasion. In reality, the timing was strategic. The Polish army was already heavily engaged in the west. Communication lines were shattered, and command structures were in chaos. The Germans had advanced far enough that the Soviets could move in without risk of direct confrontation, at least for now. The Eastern Front collapses. The Polish eastern frontier had been only lightly defended, as the main army had been committed to stopping the Germans. Most units stationed in the east were border guards, reserve formations, and training battalions. Against over 600,000 Soviet troops, supported by tanks and aircraft, these forces could offer only token resistance. Some garrisons surrendered without firing a shot, believing their orders, which often told them to avoid fighting the Soviets and instead try to retreat toward neutral Romania or Hungary. Others, like the Korpus Ochrony Pogranicze Border Protection Corps, fought bitter but brief skirmishes before being overrun. A new prisoner crisis. The Soviet advance captured hundreds of thousands of Polish soldiers. Many were sent to hastily established prison camps in places like Kozelski. Officers, police, and intellectuals were singled out for special treatments, a grim foreshadowing of the K-10 massacre to come in 1940. Impact on the war. For Polish commanders still fighting in the West, the Soviet invasion was a devastating blow. It eliminated any hope of regrouping in the eastern provinces and continuing the fight. Instead, it forced a new strategic decision: continue resistance in Poland until overwhelmed, or order surviving units to escape to Allied countries, France, Britain, via Romania, and Hungary. To fight another day, Marshal Edward Rydszmigli, the Polish commander-in-chief, issued orders for troops to avoid engaging the Soviets and to head for neutral borders. It was a painful directive, but facing two invading powers at once, continued defense on all fronts was impossible. German-Soviet handshake within days. Soviet and German troops met along their agreed demarcation line. On September 22, in the city of Brest-Litovsk, Wehrmacht and Red Army officers held a joint parade, a chilling symbol of the temporary alliance between Hitler and Stalin. The entry of the Soviet Union into the conflict ensured that Poland's defeat was now only a matter of time. For the besieged defenders of Warsaw, it meant one more grim reality. No help was coming from the east. The capital would have to face its fate alone. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 was not only a joint act of aggression, it was also a rare and uneasy partnership between two ideologically opposed regimes. Despite their mutual hatred, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union worked together with surprising efficiency to dismantle the Polish state in a matter of weeks. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in action. The foundation for this cooperation had been laid on August 23, 1939, when German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop and Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov signed a non-aggression pact in Moscow. Its secret protocol divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Germany would take Western Poland and Lithuania. The Soviet Union would take Eastern Poland, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and later Bessarabia. When the Wehrmacht invaded Poland on September 1, it acted knowing the Red Army would soon move from the east, preventing any Polish defensive line from being re-established. Coordinated military movements, although there was no joint operational command. Communication channels existed between Berlin and Moscow to avoid accidental clashes. On September 17, as Soviet troops crossed the eastern frontier, they informed the Germans of their movements to prevent friendly fire incidents. In some cases, German forces paused their advances to allow the Soviets to occupy designated areas under the pact. This careful choreography culminated in joint occupation ceremonies, the most famous being at Brest-Litovsk on September 22, where German General Heinz Guderian and Soviet Brigadier Semyon Krivoshein reviewed a combined parade of troops. Division of the country. The formal partition came with the German-Soviet Boundary and Friendship Treaty on September 28, 1939. The agreement shifted the border slightly, transferring Lithuania to the Soviet sphere in exchange for more of central Poland going to Germany. Created an official demarcation line roughly along the Bug River. Included clauses for political cooperation, such as suppressing Polish resistance and preventing the escape of Polish military personnel. Exchanges of prisoners and civilians. One of the most chilling aspects of this cooperation was the mutual handover of prisoners. Germans transferred thousands of Polish soldiers, especially those from the eastern provinces, to the Soviets. Soviets handed over Polish officers and activists from Western Poland to the Germans. Both sides targeted Polish elites officers, clergy, teachers, and civil servants for imprisonment or execution. This was the first stage in what historians now recognize as a coordinated campaign to destroy the Polish intelligentsia, removing any potential leadership for a future independent Poland. Economic and strategic collaboration beyond military matters. The pact included economic agreements. The Soviets supplied Germany with oil, grain, and raw materials critical to sustaining the German war machine under British blockade. In return, Germany sent machinery, weapons, technology, and industrial goods. An alliance of convenience, this period of cooperation was never based on trust, only on mutual interest. Both Hitler and Stalin viewed the arrangement as temporary, a breathing space before an inevitable confrontation, but in September 1939, it worked flawlessly. Two great powers, working hand in glove, erased an independent nation from the map. For the people of Poland, German-Soviet cooperation meant a double occupation. Two brutal regimes enforcing their own systems of terror on their respective halves of the country. And for the world, it was a stark warning that ideological enemies could unite when conquest was at stake. With Poland's military resistance broken in the West, by late September 1939, the German occupation began almost instantly. It was not a slow consolidation, it was a rapid, brutal transformation of society, guided by Hitler's vision of Poland as a land to be exploited, resettled, and stripped of its leadership. The general plan for Poland Nazi policy toward Poland was shaped by racial ideology. According to Hitler and his planners, ethnic Poles were considered subhumans, untermenschen, destined for servitude or removal. Jews, blamed for every conceivable ill in Nazi propaganda, were targeted for total exclusion from society, initially through segregation, later through mass extermination. Germanization of selected territories was to be carried out immediately, replacing Polish culture with German institutions. The western and northern regions, Poznań, Upper Silesia, Pomerania, and parts of were annexed directly into the Reich. The rest became the so-called General Government, a colonial-style administrative zone under Governor-General Hans Frank. Early waves of violence. The occupation began with a campaign of terror, intelligence action, a coordinated series of mass arrests and executions targeting Poland's intellectual and political elite teachers, priests, lawyers, community leaders. By the end of 1939, tens of thousands had been murdered. Public humiliations. Poles were beaten in the streets, forced to kneel, or made to perform degrading acts to demonstrate German dominance. Random shootings. Entire villages could be punished for alleged resistance or sabotage. Persecution of Jews in every city and town. Jewish life was targeted from day one. Businesses were seized or destroyed. Jews were forced to wear identifying armbands. Synagogues were burned, often with sacred texts thrown into the street. In some areas, ghettoization began almost immediately, fencing Jewish communities into cramped, unsanitary districts. Economic plunder. German occupation authorities moved quickly to strip Poland of its resources. Agricultural production was requisitioned to feed the Wehrmacht and German civilians. Factories and railroads were seized. Machinery was dismantled and shipped to Germany. Bank accounts were frozen, and private property was confiscated under the pretext of Germanizing the economy. Suppression of culture and identity. Polish schools, universities, and cultural institutions were shut down or placed under heavy censorship. The teaching of history, literature, and national symbols was forbidden. German replaced Polish in official life in annexed territories. Books and archives were looted or destroyed to erase historical memory. Hans Frank made it clear: Poland shall be treated as a colony. The Poles shall be the slaves of the German Reich. Seeds of resistance. Yet, even in these first weeks, the brutality had an unintended effect. It hardened Polish resolve. Underground newspapers, secret schools, and the first networks of the Polish underground state began forming before the year ended. For the occupiers, Poland was to be a laboratory for Nazi racial policy. For the Poles, it became a battleground for survival, not just of territory, but of identity, culture, and human dignity. While the Wehrmacht imposed Nazi rule in western and central Poland, the Soviet Union began its own brand of occupation in the east, no less ruthless, though cloaked in the language of liberation. On September 17, 1939, the Red Army crossed the border, claiming to protect Ukrainians and Belarusians from German aggression. In reality, Stalin's goal was to absorb these territories into the USSR and eradicate Polish influence entirely. Incorporation into the Soviet Union by November 1939. Eastern Poland was divided between the Belarusian SSR and the Ukrainian SSR. Soviet authorities wasted no time in Sovietizing the region. Polish institutions dissolved, government offices, courts, newspapers, and political parties were banned. Forced collectivization. Private farms and businesses were seized, folded into collective farms or state enterprises. Mandatory Soviet citizenship. Residents were declared Soviet citizens, often without consent, losing their Polish passports and rights. Targeting the Polish elite, the NKVD Soviet secret police identified potential class enemies and counter-revolutionaries, often the same categories targeted by the Nazis in the West. Military officers, police, and government officials, landowners, industrialists, and merchants, teachers, priests, and intellectuals. Tens of thousands were arrested in the first months. Many were sent to Gulag labor camps in Siberia and Kazakhstan. Others would never return. Mass deportations between February 1940 and June 1941. The Soviets carried out 4 major waves of deportations, uprooting hundreds of thousands. Entire families were loaded onto cattle cars in freezing conditions. Destinations ranged from remote forest settlements to Arctic work camps. Mortality was high from hunger, disease, and exposure. Estimates vary, but at least 320,000 to 1 million Polish citizens were deported during the occupation. The Katyn massacre, perhaps the most infamous act of Soviet repression, came in the spring of 1940. Over 22,000 Polish military officers, police, and intelligentsia prisoners from camps like Starobelsk and Ostashkov were executed on direct orders from Stalin and the Politburo. Their bodies were buried in mass graves in places such as Katyn Forest, Kharkov, and Mednoy. For decades, the Soviet Union denied responsibility, blaming the Germans until finally admitting the truth in 1990. Cultural suppression and propaganda. The Soviets outlawed Polish language instruction in many schools, replacing it with Russian or Ukrainian. Statues and portraits of Lenin and Stalin replaced Polish symbols. Propaganda portrayed the Red Army as a liberator, while branding Poland's pre-war government as fascist. A climate of fear. Life under Soviet rule was defined by uncertainty. A neighbor's careless remark, a student's loyalty questioned, or a past affiliation with a Polish organization could mean arrest and disappearance. Families learned to speak in whispers. The eastern territories of Poland were now under the grip of a different totalitarian power. But the result was the same as under the Nazis: the dismantling of the Polish state, the destruction of its leadership, and the suppression of its people's identity. By the third week of September 1939, the fate of Poland was already sealed. German forces pressed in from the west, north, and south. Soviet forces advanced from the east, yet scattered pockets of resistance cut off, undersupplied, but unbroken, continued to fight. Warsaw, the beating heart holds out. Inside the Polish capital, defenders clung to their positions despite relentless Luftwaffe bombings and artillery barrages. Civilians dug trenches in the streets, manned barricades, and ferried ammunition under fire. The Polish army, reinforced by retreating units, mounted counterattacks in the suburbs, even briefly retaking ground. But by late September, food was scarce, water systems had collapsed, and the hospitals overflowed with wounded. Still, Warsaw refused to surrender. Its defense had become a symbol for the nation. Hel Peninsula. Fighting on the coast, far to the north. The Hel Peninsula garrison continued to resist the German advance long after surrounding areas had fallen. Using coastal batteries originally intended to repel a naval attack, the defenders shelled German positions inland. German forces had to commit significant resources to isolate and neutralize the position, delaying their consolidation of the Baltic coast. The Hel garrison held out until October 2, one of the last major formations to capitulate. The battle for Lwów in the east, the city of Lwów, now Lviv, Ukraine, found itself encircled by Germans on one side and advancing Soviets on the other. Polish forces initially repelled German assaults, inflicting heavy casualties. When Soviet forces arrived on September 19, they presented themselves as liberators from the Germans. The exhausted defenders, unaware of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact's true nature, negotiated with the Soviets only to see officers and soldiers later interned or deported. Modlin Fortress, a final stronghold. North of Warsaw, the Modlin Fortress became another center of stubborn defense. Built in the 19th century and modernized in the interwar years, its thick walls and underground facilities made it a tough target. German artillery, including massive siege guns, pounded it day and night, but the garrison resisted until September 29, surrendering only after Warsaw itself had fallen. The ongoing skirmishes, beyond the famous sieges, small units, cavalry patrols, and ad hoc militias carried on the fight. Forest bands harassed German supply lines. Isolated army groups attempted breakouts toward Romania or Hungary. In the Buza region, remnants of the Polish counteroffensive fought a delaying action, buying precious days for others to escape. A defeat without surrender. By early October, all organized resistance in Poland had been crushed, yet the fighting spirit did not die. Tens of thousands of soldiers who escaped through neutral borders would form the backbone of the Polish armed forces in exile, fighting alongside the Allies in France, Britain, and beyond. Others stayed behind, melting into the civilian population to join the underground state, the largest resistance network in occupied Europe. The last pockets of resistance may not have changed the outcome of the September campaign, but they ensured that Poland's fall was anything but silent. Every extra day of defiance was a reminder to friend and foe alike that Poland had been conquered, but not defeated. By late September 1939, Warsaw was a city under siege in every sense of the word, surrounded on all sides by German forces and cut off from the rest of the country. The Polish capital had endured weeks of relentless bombardment from the air and heavy artillery. Food stocks were running dangerously low, clean water was scarce, and the streets were littered with rubble and the unburied dead. Yet, despite the hopeless situation, the defenders fought on with a grim determination. The encirclement tightens after the crushing defeats in the field, most notably the collapse of Polish forces at the Buza. German armies swung eastward, closing in on the capital. The 10th Army and 8th Army pressed from the west, while 3rd Army advanced from East Prussia. By mid-September, Warsaw was completely encircled. Inside the city, General Julius commanded a patchwork garrison, regular army units that had fallen back to the capital, police, volunteers, and remnants of formations destroyed elsewhere. They faced an enemy with overwhelming superiority in artillery, armor, and air power. The bombardment intensifies. Beginning September 17, the Luftwaffe launched some of the most intense air raids of the campaign. Civilian districts were deliberately targeted to break morale. On September 25 later, dubbed Black Monday, over 400 German bombers struck the city in waves, dropping incendiaries and high explosives. Fires raged uncontrollably, water mains shattered, and hospitals were reduced to smoking ruins. Estimates suggest up to 10,000 civilians died in a single day. German artillery joined the destruction, pounding Warsaw without pause. The city's infrastructure collapsed, trams halted, electricity failed, and food distribution became impossible. Negotiations and surrender. By September 26, the situation was untenable. Ammunition was running out, medical supplies were exhausted, and typhus threatened to spread among the population. German envoys demanded surrender, but initially refused. hoping for relief forces that would never come. On September 27, realizing that continued resistance would mean the wholesale slaughter of civilians, agreed to negotiate the following day. Formal terms were signed. Polish troops would lay down arms but be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. Civilians would be spared reprisals, a promise soon broken in many cases. Aftermath. On September 29, German troops marched into the ruined city, parading through streets lined with dazed, hollow-eyed survivors. Around 140,000 Polish soldiers went into captivity. The civilian death toll from the siege is estimated at 20,000 to 25,000, with tens of thousands more wounded or left homeless. Warsaw's fall marked the symbolic end of organized Polish resistance in the West. Yet for many Poles, it was not the end of the war merely, the beginning of a long occupation and the rise of an underground struggle that would continue for years. When the guns fell silent in early October 1939, Poland as a sovereign state had ceased to exist. In barely 5 weeks, it had been carved apart by two totalitarian powers under the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The campaign was over, but the consequences were only beginning to unfold. Formal partition. On September 28, 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the German-Soviet Boundary and Friendship Treaty, adjusting their earlier secret agreement. Germany took western and central Poland, including Warsaw, and the Soviet Union took eastern Poland, encompassing cities like WWII, Lviv, and Białystok. The border was set roughly along the Bug River. Both sides celebrated the division publicly as a triumph of order and security, while privately working to dismantle all traces of Polish independence. Population exchanges and forced transfers. The treaty included provisions for population transfers to align ethnic groups with the new borders. Ethnic Germans in Soviet-controlled Poland were sent west to the Reich. Ukrainians and Belarusians in German-occupied zones were sent east. In practice, these were often forced relocations carried out under duress, with families uprooted and possessions confiscated. Economic plunder. The occupiers wasted no time exploiting their spoils. Germany seized factories, railways, and farmland to fuel the war economy. Polish currency was replaced in stages, and German firms took over key industries. The USSR confiscated private property, collectivized agriculture, and integrated the local economy into the Soviet system. Both powers looted cultural treasures, art manuscripts, religious relics, transporting them to Berlin or Moscow. Suppression of national identity. While Nazi terror focused on exterminating political, cultural, and ethnic groups, especially Jews, the Soviets targeted the Polish intelligentsia, clergy, and former state officials. Both aimed to erase Polish national consciousness. Place names were changed. Polish language use was restricted or eliminated in schools and administration. Symbols of Polish statehood were banned. Propaganda of unity. German and Soviet propaganda, despite their ideological differences, sang a similar tune. Poland was an artificial state whose collapse was inevitable. Each occupier painted itself as the protector of its respective ethnic kin, while branding the Polish government as corrupt and oppressive. The human cost. The Polish campaign was often portrayed abroad as a quick, almost bloodless blitzkrieg, but reality told another story. 200,000 plus Polish military casualties killed, wounded, or missing. Tens of thousands of civilian deaths from bombardment, massacres, and reprisals. Over 1 million Polish soldiers and civilians taken prisoner by both Germany and the US. For the Polish people, the war had not ended, it had merely entered a new, darker phase. The next years would be marked by occupation, resistance, and unimaginable suffering under two regimes that had, for the moment, found common cause in the destruction of their neighbor. The German conquest of Poland in September 1939 became, in Nazi propaganda, the textbook example of blitzkrieg lightning war. Newspapers, newsreels, and speeches presented it as a triumph of speed, technology, and tactical genius, where tanks and aircraft struck deep, shattered enemy lines, and forced surrender in a matter of weeks. To the outside world, the fall of Poland seemed to confirm the myth of an unstoppable Wehrmacht, the myth of the lightning victory. The term blitzkrieg was never an official German doctrine in 1939. The campaign in Poland relied as much on traditional methods, encirclement, heavy artillery bombardment, and sheer numerical superiority as on fast-moving armored spearheads. The Wehrmacht fielded about 2,700 tanks and over 2,000 aircraft against a Polish force that was less mechanized, poorly equipped, and hampered by outdated command systems. Poland's geography also played into German hands. Flat plains ideal for tank maneuvers, a relatively short distance from the German border to Warsaw, and few natural defensive barriers. German advances were quick, not only because of military innovation, but also because Poland was strategically vulnerable, isolated diplomatically, and attacked from two sides after the Soviet invasion on September 17. The brutal reality beneath the veneer of military brilliance lay the true cost. The rapid collapse of the Polish state was accompanied by extraordinary civilian suffering. Civilian deaths. Estimates placed the number of Polish civilians killed during the September campaign at 50,000 to 60,000. Many died in indiscriminate bombings of cities, others in massacres carried out by Wehrmacht units and SS death squads. Military losses. Poland lost about 66,000 soldiers killed and over 130,000 wounded, with around 700,000 taken prisoner by Germany and the Soviet Union combined. Infrastructure. Whole cities Warsaw, most notably, were reduced to rubble. Roads, railways, and bridges were systematically destroyed or seized for German use. A war against the people from the outset. The German campaign was waged not only against the Polish army but against the entire population. Civilians were strafed by aircraft while fleeing on roads. Food supplies were looted or wrecked. The Luftwaffe deliberately targeted non-military sites to terrorize the population into submission, an early preview of the total war strategy the Nazis would unleash across Europe. The Soviet occupation in the East brought no relief. Mass arrests, executions, and deportations began within days. For Poles, the swift military defeat was followed by years of systemic oppression, cultural destruction, and forced labor under two hostile regimes. The lesson misunderstood in the capitals of London and Paris. The fall of Poland was viewed with alarm, but also with a dangerous oversimplification, that Germany's victory had been due to an unstoppable new style of war that could slice through any defense. This interpretation overlooked the specific vulnerabilities Poland faced and underestimated the Wehrmacht's reliance on conventional firepower and overwhelming numbers. When war came to the West in 1940, Allied leaders would again be caught off guard, not because blitzkrieg was some flawless formula, but because they had failed to grasp how it actually worked. The September campaign was over in a month, but its human and political consequences would last for generations. Behind the myth of lightning war was a grim reality: the destruction of a nation, the subjugation of millions, and the first step into a world conflict that would claim tens of millions more.